This is an Irish whiskey with a bit of a tropical twist. This week, let me tell you about the Irishman whiskey that was finished in Caribbean rum casks. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this week I'm looking at the Irishman Irish whiskey that was finished in Caribbean rum casks. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, the Irishman is a brand that's been around for a while. They're one of those brands that I would say has been like quietly working away in the background. They've been picking up lots of awards, but they often don't get a huge amount of attention put to them, and it's the Walsh whiskey brand is kind of behind it, and the Writer's Tears brand, and they're generally known as being solid, dependable whiskies that are always kind of good as a go-to whiskey. Maybe in an effort to kind of revitalize or get more of that market attention, they recently redesigned their bottles for the Irishman and the Writer's Tears. The Writer's Tears looks pretty similar to what it used to look like, just with a couple of little tweaks. The Irishman, though, it's much different. It used to be this kind of squat bottle. Now it's taller, it's thinner, it has a lot of embossment on it. The actual whiskey here has a braille on it as well, and just kind of looks a little bit nicer. I think though the whiskey inside is completely unchanged. It's just a matter of different packaging though. And what is this whiskey? Well, it is a blended whiskey, but it's not one of those standard blends of whiskies that is, a lot of grain whiskey with something else in it. This here is 70% single malt whiskey and 30% single pot still whiskey, which is the style of whiskey that's unique to Ireland. So this is a blend of two kind of the good styles of whiskey. I say good with inverted commas because grain whiskey I think can be very, very nice, but this definitely has the more kind of expensive or harder to produce whiskies in the blend as opposed to the grain whiskey. There's no age statement on the whiskey, but it was aged, from doing a little bit of research on it, it was aged for between 6 and 8 years in ex-bourbon casks before being given a 6-month finish in rum from St. Lucia, the island of St. Lucia. And after doing my research, I found out that the rum comes from the Chairman's Reserve kind of rum company. And what they did was they aged their rum for about 2 years or so in oak casks, they typically use ex-bourbon casks. And then they sent them over to the Irishman to refill with the Irishman whiskey. So it was in there for about 2 years, which doesn't sound like a huge amount of time, but rum in the Caribbean, it ages pretty quickly. And I think from 3 years old is when you can start calling a rum an old rum, whereas for whiskey, typically you wouldn't see whiskey that's under 3 years because it would not be called Irish whiskey. So that rum was kind of medium old, I'd say, but it probably gave a lot of flavour to the casks, which was then used for this whiskey. Last few details on it, it comes in at 46% alcohol by volume, which I think is a very nice percentage for drinking. It's not so hot you're going to get any burn, but it's also not down the floor, so you get a nice middle ground of flavour and kind of easy approachableness. It is natural colour and it's non-chill filtered, so I think that's all there's to say about it. So let's go in for the nose on the Irishman Caribbean cask. Okay, it's very rummy sweet. I wouldn't say there's a huge amount of like rum funk. Like when I describe rum, I get that kind of earthy, kind of cane sugar note, and for me that always comes through as this kind of funkiness, where like it's earthiness, where it's not unpleasant by any means, it's just that deep-seated sweetness. I'm not really getting that here, but I'm just getting like that sweetness of it, rather than the earthy sweet notes and getting the top line sweet notes coming through from that rum cask. There's some like apples and pears and kind of like orchard fruit notes coming through, but really I'm getting a lot of that sweetness, a lot of like caramel coming through, and some vanilla, kind of reminding me of like a vanilla toffee, that kind of like where it's not like hard like a caramel, it's not like super brown sugar, but it's a bit more creamy and rounded out, like that kind of, creaminess is what I'd say I'm getting here on the nose immediately, with all those kind of sugary sweet notes. And that's all wrapping on top of those kind of apples, pears, orchard fruit notes. I'm not really getting a huge amount of like peppery spice. Like pot still spice, you're gonna get a lot of like peppery spice from that, but as only 30% of this blend is pot still, with 70% of it being single malt, I'm getting more of that kind of grain, the toasted oats, toasted barley, toasted kind of biscuits, those kind of caramelized grain notes. There's also, just going back to the fruitiness, like there's a little bit of raisins in there, like a little bit of like, not like a dried raisin, like a golden raisin, where you get that like bright flash, like sweet fruits, almost tropical, but not really a tropical fruit, still with that kind of like sweetness, sugary sweetness there. But I'm also getting, I wouldn't say honey, but like honeycomb, like, you know, that kind of the candy you get where it's honeycomb, it's that kind of flavor, that kind of smell is coming through here. I wouldn't say honey, but like that, again, sugary, sweet honeycomb flavor coming through on the nose. So I think that's probably enough on the nose. Let's go in for the palate and see how it is. Cheers. That is a nice, rich mouthfeel, again, with that toffee, with that kind of creamy note, but again, that brown sugar. Again, not like rummy funk, but like that rummy sweetness coming through. Almost like a white rum, kind of where you get that sugary sweetness coming through without that heavy note coming as well. But like, it really does lean in with that creaminess, the caramel, almost like a vanilla pudding, or like a banana, actually more like a banana pudding, where you get that kind of wrapper of creaminess with all that sweetness, with that vanilla, with that kind of flavor coming through. There's also still more of those like malted grains, toasted grains, like that barley note does come through. Again, it is a 100% barley whiskey, with some of it being made up of raw barley and most of it made up with malted barley, so it does have that grainy character does come through. I'm getting still a little bit of that orchard fruits, like the apples and pears, but less so. Like there's a bit of spiciness coming through. It wasn't really getting on the nose a huge amount of spice, but on the palate I've got a little bit of peppery spice, so I'm going to go in again for a second sip and see if I can find more about that spice. Cheers. Yeah, there's a little bit of like white pepper. It's like a tingly on the tip of your tongue. I wouldn't say it's a huge like spicy peppery bomb, but you do get a nice bit of like peppery tingle those come through. But again, like on the second sip around, it was mostly that sweet toffee. Think like a Werther's original, like that kind of rich, sugary, caramel, toffee, that kind of vibe where it's nice and sweet with that vanilla, with those other notes coming through. The creaminess actually is reminding me a little bit of like a kind of like a milk chocolate, where you get that sugary sweetness, but it's all wrapped up with that creaminess. Like I wouldn't say there's a density of like milk chocolate where you get that cocoa and you get all those other flavors in, but that kind of, the mouthfeel reminds you of like a milk chocolate with a little bit of like those earthy kind of notes from the oak coming through, but not enough to really say it's milk chocolate. It's more in that higher end caramel, toffee, kind of vanilla, banana pudding, that kind of flavor. So I'm gonna go in again for a final sip, focus on the finish and see how it is into there. Cheers. Okay, so on the finish, like up front you get all that sweetness, you get all that like wrapper of caramel, wrapper of like creamy notes, and that does kind of fade off, I'd say medium quickly. Like the oak spice I was talking about there a little bit at the end, the peppery spice I was talking about there, that stays on. Like I'm still getting that almost like a tannins, but not really drying, just like that little bit of oak spice, a little bit of like the peppery spice comes through. The sweetness does fade off. Like I've got a little bit of the mouthfeel left over, like that little bit of creaminess there, but I'd say it's medium to medium short on it. It's not like super long. Like the spicy notes as I'm talking now, they're pretty much faded, they're pretty much gone. But yeah, it was a nice, I'd say medium is as long as I'd go, probably short to medium on the finish, but nice kind of lingering of some of those nice notes. There's nothing really new in the finish, just a nice bit of flavor carrying on. Before I give my final thoughts on this whiskey, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews every Wednesday like this, and I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday. So if you want to see those, make sure you scroll down, make sure you hit subscribe. But now, as to my final thoughts on this, I like it. I think this is a really nice, like I almost call this like a daily drinker. Like it's nice, it's sweet, it's creamy, it's got a bit of weight to it, it's got a bit of complexity, but it's not like super hard to enjoy. You don't have to like go into it and fight with it to get those flavors out. You just get a nice bit of whiskey, and a bit of that kind of rum cask influence does come through, but it doesn't dominate the whole whiskey. Like I said, Irishmen have been working away kind of quietly. I wouldn't say in the background, but they definitely got overlooked by some of the bigger Irish brands. And it's just one of those whiskey it's reliable, it's very, very tasty, very easy to enjoy, very easy to drink. So I think I'm going to keep on enjoying it. I think I'm going to keep on drinking it. And I will see you next time. Sláinte.